Hi everyone, how are you guys doing? My name is Dr. Greg Clark, and I'm a plant scientist at the University of Texas. How many of you guys have been down to the University of Texas before? Maybe to see a football game? Okay. Well, you may not have realized, but University of Texas has hundreds of labs with scientists doing important research there. And the research I do at the University of Texas is on plants. And I want to tell you about my research. But first, I want to tell you why it's so much fun to study plants. So, plants are really truly amazing. And here I have a picture of the largest flower. It's Rafflesia arnoldi. And you might think a flower this big would smell really good, but it turns out it smells like rotten meat in order to attract pollinators. Plants are also the oldest living organisms on the planet. And here I have a picture of a bristlecone pine that's able to live as long as 5,000 years. And I think that's pretty amazing too. And then lastly, I have a picture of a sequoia tree. And you guys may not know this because a lot of people believe the blue whale is the largest organism on the planet. But it turns out that the sequoia trees are much bigger than blue whales. And they can grow as tall as 300 feet tall. And scientists are still trying to figure out how a sequoia tree is able to get water from the bottom all the way up to the top. I mean, another really cool thing about plants is that seeds that are as old as 1,200 years have been shown to be germinated. And I'm talking about these lotus seeds. These lotus seeds in China. And if you think about that, that's pretty amazing that a seed can last 1,200 years and still germinate. Plants are also really important to us. We couldn't live without plants. They produce the oxygen we breathe. They produce energy we consume as food and burn for fuel. And you may not have thought about this before, but plants are basically chemical factories making all sorts of different chemicals. And the chemicals that we use for medicine, about 45% of those chemicals are originally found in plants. So it's really an interesting area of research to study plants. And the kind of research I do is to try and address the question of how do plants respond to signals. And so I thought I'd start off by asking you, what kind of signals do you respond to? Do you know when it's cold? I think you do. And what do you do when it's cold? You can put a jacket on. You can go inside and turn the thermostat up and get nice and toasty. Your body also tells you when you're tired or when you're hungry. So there are lots of signals that you respond to. What do you guys do when the bell rings? Okay, yeah, you know that it's time to get up and go to your next class. So there's lots of signals that you respond to, and there's lots of signals that plants respond to. Can you think of some signals plants respond to? Yeah, that's right. Plants need water to grow, so they definitely respond to the signal of water. A couple of signals that you may or may not know that plants are able to respond to are light and wind. And here I have a picture of some plants that were, some trees that were grown down in a valley. They grow very straight where there's not much wind. But then trees that are growing up in the mountains where there's lots of wind, they grow thicker and not as tall so that they can withstand the wind. So that's a response to wind. Plants also respond to light. A lot of you already know about phototropism. Say if you put some plants in a windowsill, they'll grow toward the light. You may not have seen this picture before of a seedling that's grown in the dark compared to what a seedling that's grown in the light looks like. What kind of differences can you see between those two seedlings? Yeah, that's right. The dark grown seedling is much taller. It also has its leaves curved over. They're pale and very small. And that's right, the root length is a little bit longer in the light-grown one. And if you think about where you might find a seedling growing in the dark, does anyone have an idea where you find a seedling growing in the dark? Yeah, you might find it in a cave. But where do seeds germinate? That's right, they germinate underground. So when a seed germinates underground, it's kind of in a race for its life. It needs to get above the ground to survive so it can start making a living by doing photosynthesis. So if you think about it, that might be why this seedling is so tall. It also might be why the leaves are kind of curved and small so that there's not much resistance as it tries to push through the ground. And it's really interesting that the difference between the way this seedling looks and the way this seedling looks can be initiated by the flash of a single firefly. So it doesn't take much light to make this difference. And that's because it's so important to the seedling that it grow like this in order to survive before it runs out of its stored energy in its seed. So those are a couple of responses that plants have. And in a lot of the different responses that plants make and animals, calcium is a signal inside the cell for the organism to respond to. And I want to address why calcium is a good signal. So in this diagram, you have the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. And outside of the cell, it turns out that there's high amounts of calcium. There's lots of calcium. But inside the cell, there's not much calcium. And this is the case in a cell that's not receiving a signal. And what I want to show you now is a picture of a plant cell that is growing. So it is receiving signals. And what you're looking at here is kind of like weather radar. Okay? Does anybody like to watch the weather? I love watching the radar, especially when a nice storm is coming in. And what you see here is low concentrations of calcium are shown as blue. And then as you get to the tip that's growing, this cell is only growing at the tip, you start to get more and more calcium. And then right at the tip, you see the red, that's the highest amount of calcium. And that's a signal telling this cell to grow right here at the tip. So that's an example of calcium as a signal in a plant cell. So I need to introduce to you, and you may already know what proteins are, but I need to introduce to you the idea of a protein. And I know that as you're growing up, you always hear your parents say, you know, eat your vegetables, you need to get some protein in your diet. And it turns out that beef and vegetables are high in protein. And the reason your parents want you to eat protein in your diet is that your cells are making proteins, lots and lots of proteins that allow your cells to do all the cool things that they do. And the building blocks of these proteins are amino acids. And so when you eat protein in your diet, it gets digested down to these building blocks, amino acids, and then your cells can use it to make the important proteins that you need. And what's really cool about proteins is that they come in different sizes and different shapes. And scientists use diagrams to show these different shapes. And it's the different shapes and sizes that allow the proteins to do all the different things that they can do. I can use my muscles, move my muscles because of motor proteins that I have. And I can see you and you can see me because of proteins that you have in your eyes. And you and plants can respond to signals because of signaling proteins. So I want to show you some diagrams of some signaling proteins. And this protein here is called calmodulin. And it's probably one of the most famous signaling proteins that we know about. And it gets its name because it is modulated by calcium. So here's a picture of calmodulin, the shape of calmodulin, without any calcium around. But then when the cell gets a signal and calcium is increased inside the cell, calmodulin can bind calcium. You see these two yellow spears represent the calcium. And I think you can tell that there's a difference in the shape of calmodulin when it's not binding calcium and after it binds calcium. So it looks much different. And after it binds calcium, it becomes activated and can do other things in the cell. And it can go back. This is kind of like a light switch, turning a light switch on. You add the calcium, it activates calmodulin, you turn the light switch on. If you take the calcium away, you can turn the light switch off. So another question that you might be curious about is, are there other calcium binding proteins in cells? And the answer is yes. In your bodies, there are other, in your cells in your bodies, there are other proteins called annexins, and they can also bind calcium. And here is the picture of the structure of annexin in a cell that isn't responding to signals, and calcium is low inside the cell. And then when the cell responds to a signal and calcium goes up, you can see that it binds these yellow spears that represent the calcium, and you can see that there is a change in the shape of annexin. It's a little bit more curved or concave. And now annexin, when it binds calcium, has become activated. So in my research as a graduate student for my PhD, I wanted to work on signaling proteins. And one of the things I want to show you is how small proteins are. This makes it really challenging to do research on proteins, because you can see that you need to magnify things 1,000,000 times in order to just barely see a protein. So proteins are really small, and that makes it challenging to do experiments on them. The main question that I wanted to address as a graduate student was that I knew that animals had annexins, but I wanted to know whether plants might also have annexins. Animals and plants both have calmodulin, so it was possible that animals and plants might both have annexins. And in order to answer this question, what I did is I grew some pea plants in the dark, and then I put them in with a solution into a blender, and I made a pea smoothie. And then I did a bunch of steps to separate out the proteins, because there are thousands of proteins in cells. And I wanted to separate them out to answer the question of whether I could find a plant annexin. And after much hard work, I found that yes, indeed, peas have annexins. And so this represents probably 2 or 3 years of my work in a cold room trying to purify annexins. When you work on proteins, you want to do it in cold temperatures, because proteins are unstable at higher temperatures. But I was very excited when I first saw this picture of an annexin. And so scientists, because proteins are so small, scientists use tools to visualize the proteins based on the size of the protein. And I did a special test to show that yes, indeed, this was an annexin. And so once I had discovered that peas have annexin, I can ask some other questions. And one of the questions I was very interested in is how similar is animal annexin and plant annexin. So what I'm showing you here is an alignment of the amino acids in a chicken annexin and in a pea annexin. And so each letter designates a different amino acid. Remember, the amino acids are the building blocks of the protein. And wherever you see a solid line, that means it's exact same amino acid. So what I was able to show here is that the pea annexin has some amino acids that are exactly the same and some that are similar, but there's enough similarity between chicken annexin and pea annexin that I knew for sure that the pea protein that I had discovered was an annexin. So, in conclusion, I want to talk about plant annexin signaling. So, I picked an example in which I know annexins are involved in the response. And we talked about earlier that plants can sense the amount of water in the environment. And so if you don't have any water and there's drought, one of the things that happen inside cells of plants is there's an increase in calcium. And this is like turning on a light switch. Okay? And one of the things that happens when you increase the calcium is that the annexin proteins can be activated. They bind this increase in calcium. And this is like turning on lots of light switches. And this allows the plants to have a response. And in the case of annexins, it allows plants to survive this drought. And I have a picture of some plants that show that this that annexins are able to help plants survive drought. And so in this top row of plants, what you see is some plants that have some annexin protein. And you can see in this case, when they didn't get any water, when they were subjected to drought, that 2 out of the 5 plants were able to survive. But then in the middle row are plants that have no annexin. And what happened to them? Yeah, they didn't do very well. They all died. And then in the bottom row, there are some plants that have extra annexin. And what happened there is that, well, 4 out of the 5 are doing really well, but even this plant in the middle is still alive. So it turns out that even the amount of annexin that the cells have can help the plant survive. And if the plant doesn't have any annexin and it's going to be subjected to drought, well, then it's in big trouble. So just to recap, what I discovered in my PhD experiments is that plants use annexins to respond to signals, just like animals, and that plant and animal signaling are very similar. Plants and animals don't look like each other, but it turns out inside the cells, the way they respond to signals is really similar. They both use annexins and calmodulin and calcium, and so they're very similar. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'd love to answer some questions that you might have about my research or about my time as a graduate student. So thank you.